Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining us today for our webinar on unlocking programmatic outperformance. Just before we kick off proper, I just wanted to cover a couple of housekeeping points. Firstly, we will be sharing the recording of this session with all attendees afterwards. And secondly is you'll see down in the bottom right of your screen there is a button which allows you to ask questions. We're not likely to be able to answer questions live in this session, but please feel free to submit any questions that you have as we go through, and we will follow up over email following the session. To kick us off, I just want to introduce myself and my co-presenter Alice today. I'm Anna, I'm the Director of Strategy at Incubeta, although my background is very much in programmatic and creative. And Alice's job speaks for herself. She's our current head of programmatic. The agenda for today is just to kind of give a bit of a scene setting, bit of background, and then we kind of really want to dive into three topics, particularly which are measurement, creative, and media. We're looking at trying to make this tangible and useful to you. So hopefully there'll be points from each of those sessions that you can take away and apply to your own campaigns. So to kick us off, I think we just want to start by actually starting with what do we mean by programmatic? I think this is a term we see a lot of people use, and everyone means slightly different things by it. For the purposes of today, at least, we're defining programmatic here as essentially any digital media channel that isn't search and social, but it particularly isn't platform traded. So it isn't within a walled garden. So typically where we have a publisher on the sell side, and there's a sort of that kind of exchange process. We don't necessarily limit this to performance or to RTB, which I know are sometimes the connotations of programmatic. This includes CTV, it includes digital out of home, it includes YouTube, etc. And I think what a lot of these channels have in common is that while they are very much digital channels, most of them represent an evolution or a transition of kind of more traditional media into the online world. A lot of them have kind of analogs. Display is kind of the online version of print. Digital out of home is the online version of out of home. And so I think these very much form a set of channels that operate slightly differently to the more digital native channels, things like search and social. And why does programmatic matter? Why should we care about it? I think this is a stat that really helps to sum that up. Social media is a massive part of digital marketing, but actually, if you look at internet usage in the UK, at least, only 30% of people's time online is spent on social media. What programmatic gives you the opportunity to do is really engage with people at all those other times. Some of the audience might be incremental, and there are still some people who aren't on any social media platforms. But even for those who are, it's different ways of engaging with them at different moments in different formats. It's something that's really, I think, currently quite undervalued. Programmatic, as we've mentioned, it's very diverse. There's a lot of different channels, and clearly, you're going to be using CTV to achieve something quite different to say a native campaign. But I do think there's some commonalities across all of them, which is why they're worth talking about as a full set in terms of benefits that they bring to your campaign. The first of those is reach and scale. That 30% figure kind of speaks for itself. But what you're doing with programmatic is you're reaching the whole internet, and you're reaching beyond the whole internet as well. You're reaching into people's homes through their TVs. You're reaching them in their daily lives as well when you start talking about things like digital out of home in there as well. So there's clearly a lot of ability there to scale and to reinforce messages across different locations and environments. One of the really important elements of programmatic marketing that isn't necessarily there in a lot of other digital channels is the ability to associate yourself with particular brands. So particularly thinking in terms of publisher brands. This could either be in terms of kind of just quality premium media providers. Think about it says something about you as a brand if you're showing up on the Telegraph as opposed to the Daily Mail, whichever of those suits you better. But there's clearly those associations to be had, and it also helps you align and demonstrate alignment with audiences. Breadth of targeting. I mean, obviously, online marketing in general is known for its ability to target. But I think what programmatic brings into the mix is more levers that you can pull. You have, custom data, whether that's coming from third-party segments, whether it's your own first-party data that you can bring into your buying and your planning. But you also have partner data, publisher data, especially in these sort of post-GDPR world, post-cookie world, is becoming increasingly important and valuable. And working with partners gives you a really good ability to leverage that beyond what, say, Google can provide in themselves. And also the contextual signals, which I've already touched on, that you can bring into things, be that specific sites you're showing on, be it particular content you're showing alongside, be it creators that you're associating yourself with. And finally, is the personalization capabilities. To be honest, I don't love the word personalization. I tend to prefer talking about relevance. I think personalization tends to conjure up a certain notion of retargeting ads following you around the internet. But what it really does is allow you to tailor your messaging and your creative, not just at a person level, at a user level, although that is important, but also to the moment and to their environment, to maximize the chances of that message really landing with them. So that being said, why do many brands still struggle to realize the full value and potential of programmatic? That's not to say that brands aren't running programmatic. We know we still have the stats that show it's still a growing sector. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the growth in digital video, CTV, and so on, that is really driving a lot of that. But I do think that the brands who make programmatic work make it work in a certain way. They tend to see it more as a brand, sort of exclusively brand-led channel. And it's often bought alongside the more traditional media. It often sits with the same team or agency who's buying the linear TV, for example. It's not typically seen as a results-oriented channel, and therefore I think we miss a lot of its potential. It also tends to be the remit of larger brands for those reasons as well, I think. So again, it's not seen as a channel for growth of sort of medium-sized businesses as they're looking to expand. It's seen as that channel that is there for when you've made it and you just want to get your logo in front of as many people as you can. What are the reasons why this doesn't necessarily come through? I think part of it is a poor reputation that it has. There's constant news, as I'm sure everyone is aware, around topics like brand safety, ad fraud, and so on. And again, particularly down that more performance end of the spectrum in programmatic is particularly an issue, and I think that can understandably be very off-putting to brands who don't necessarily have the firepower to really curate what they're doing. It's executionally complex. It's an increasingly fragmented media world, and you layer that on top of the already complicated system of different buying platforms, various sort of mediators in between, and it's very difficult to have confidence that you're buying the media in the most efficient and effective way. And even just to have access to the tools that you need in order to be able to do that. There's measurement challenges with it. Again, the people who often struggle to get into programmatic, the people who are very used to working with last click attribution models, for example, to look at their search and their affiliate and their social, or maybe they look at purely a kind of a brand level, but don't necessarily tie those kind of brand metrics back to kind of business results. And measurement for programmatic is more complex, I think, than some of those other digital channels, and it is something that makes it difficult for people to justify that investment that they're looking for to help explore and grow. And what all of this kind of comes round to is that it's seen as driving a lack of performance. I've put that in quotation marks because I think performance is a term to think about a little bit here. But I think, a lot of people struggle to either believe it's driving results or to show that it's driving results, whatever those results might be. As I say, we're not necessarily talking sort of direct response ROI here. So that kind of reference to performance kind of brings me to what we've called this, which is a reference to outperformance. I think if you've been to any of our events recently, you'll have seen a slide that looks something like that. This is what we're talking about a lot at the moment in Incubeta, which is outperform marketing. And what do we mean by that? I think what we're taking is a lot of what's good about performance marketing, but we're kind of taking a step back and looking at it as a broader picture. We're saying digital marketing can be held accountable, but not just in those pure performance ways. What we're really looking to do is drive long-term growth. We're looking at how we take programmatic and turn it into something that will, drive those true business results and do so in a sustainable way that can allow you to grow over the long term. We're also looking to help you navigate complexity with confidence. I talk a lot about complexity here, but actually, and I think this will come through as we talk through, the principles behind it are simple. Yes, there's executional complexity, but actually, the principles are just good marketing principles. And I think, always be able to find your way back to those really helps to navigate through that. And fundamentally, I'm always looking to deliver results that outperform. And hopefully what we're going to talk through in the next 3 sections will help give you some kind of pointers and signposts to how you can do that with your own programmatic campaigns. So here's our agenda. As I said, we're going to talk through 3 sections. Firstly, measurement, secondly, creative, and thirdly, media. And at this point, I will hand over to Alice to talk through measurement.
Thank you, Anna. We're going to talk about measurement first in terms of what we can do to outperform in our programmatic campaigns. So first off is, why does measurement matter? So we want to know what really works in our campaigns, and this just means that we can invest more of our time and energy and budget into these campaigns. So it's very important we have sound measurement to begin with. So as Anna spoke about, and as we know, programmatic campaigns are really complex. They appear in lots of different environments. And this means that measurement of the programmatic campaigns can be tricky as well. So first up, as I mentioned, they are across lots of different inventory types, lots of different formats, lots of different platforms. So this just means that when you measure campaigns, you have to go into lots of different areas to see how your campaign's performing. And of course, in different platforms, metrics are defined differently. So what might count as a view in one platform, it'll be a completely different definition in another platform. So this can just make it very hard to measure. Also with programmatic campaigns, ads aren't likely to be directly interacted with. So unlike with search campaigns where people often click on ads, for lots of programmatic campaigns, this is not the case. You might just view an ad in passing, or it might be really hard to even measure that. So maybe for out of home, that could be quite tricky to measure. So again, that means it's more complex to set up your measurement. And then finally, best practice measurement techniques can require larger investments. So sometimes if you're doing kind of MMM, so more sophisticated measurement techniques, you might need budget set aside to pay for the MMM model and technology, but you'll also need to have sufficient investment into the channels that you're running so that you can get a read in these measurement types as well. So people often ask us, what source of truth should we be using for our programmatic campaigns? Should I be using GA or another metric? But there is no straightforward standalone measurement approach. But we have some principles that you should work to help you measure your campaigns. So we'll be going through those next. The first principle is defining your campaign goals. So this might be really basic, but people often do this maybe slightly incorrectly. So with your campaigns, you need to have 2 different KPIs. You need your success KPI and you need your optimization KPI. You shouldn't just choose what's most easily trackable in your buying platform or analytics platform, but you do need to separate these 2 KPIs. So the success KPI looks at, did this campaign even work? So this might be a more kind of longer term measurement. And you might also be measuring your campaign in the same way across lots of different platforms. So an example of this could be consideration lift. The metric number 2 is an optimization KPI. So this is a metric that you can optimize towards in your platform, and this will make sure you achieve good media quality and good buying efficiency. So every day you can come into your platform and optimize towards this metric, unlike the success KPI where you might need to look at it over a longer period of time. So if you were doing a campaign where you wanted to get more people considering buying from your brand, you would have your consideration lift as your success KPI, and then cost per visit as your optimization KPI. And I often see people just picking one of these, which just makes showing the value of your campaign hard to do. So we recommend those 2 KPIs before you've even done anything. And we all know that click-based measurement is not great to do for programmatic campaigns. This has been spoken about for years, so we know it's not new, but we still do see people using click-based metrics within their campaigns. This might come out where people are optimizing towards click-through rate, or showing the value of tests with click-through rate, or even measuring traffic to site through that measure as well. So it is still around, and so it is worth us talking about. But you shouldn't rely on your click-based metrics for several reasons. First is your business success. So clicks don't drive business success, and there's no correlation between people clicking on a programmatic ad and generating sales. Also with reach, so 90% of people never click on an ad, and it's just 8% of users who are clicking on 85% of ads. So this just means, like, if you are trying to reach people based on clicks, you're just going to be going to a really narrow pool of users. Inventory quality as well. If you're running a campaign where you're optimizing towards cost per click, then you're likely going to be appearing on not great inventory. This is because you'll be trying to serve lots of impressions just because you're chasing that click, which might in turn mean you appear on less premium inventory. And then finally, creative effectiveness. So this is what I was talking about when I said that people often optimize towards click-through rate with creative tests. A lot of people do this, but it's just not going to lead up to your overall goal. So yes, we don't rely on click-based metrics. And as I talk about click-based metrics, we want to acknowledge attribution models. So you should be building a better attribution model than just relying on last click data only. So to do this, you would be factoring in impression, view, and engagement data into your attribution model. You'd also be looking at a data-driven approach, so you can see the contribution of every channel that you're running within your marketing activity. And you don't just want to be reporting on your attribution model, but you want to be feeding your data back into buying platforms, so you can optimize towards this. But it's also important for us to acknowledge that there's always problems with attribution models. So they can't account for behavior of people who haven't actually seen that. And as we were talking about earlier, that metrics aren't comparable across different channels. So again, it can be really tricky to measure within your attribution model. And overall, your attribution model isn't going to tell you about the incrementality of your marketing efforts. So these are all things to keep in mind, that there's no one single way of measuring the success of your campaign, but you need to look at several different points to get an overall picture of how your activity is running. So the fourth principle we're going to talk about is adopting a tiered approach to measurement. So this is what we have called our measurement ladder, and this tells you how you should measure each of your campaigns that are going live. So it starts off all the way at the bottom with media or platform KPIs, and then works its way up into media effectiveness. And we call this a ladder because the higher up you go in the ladder, you get a broader picture of how your marketing activity is running, and how your activity is doing within the wider marketing mix. So we're going to go to each of these in turn. So the first is media or platform KPIs, and that's something we've spoken about a little earlier on. So you want to make sure that you're defining your media or platform KPIs at the beginning of your campaign. This just means that you can optimize towards these every day or however often you're in the platform, and it will give your campaign the best chance of success. So some typical metrics for this might be a CPM, a cost per unique reach, or a ROAS. After you've defined your media or platform KPIs, it's also important to make sure you have your post-campaign studies. So this is something I really recommend when going live with any programmatic campaign, just because if you're sticking with your platform KPIs, you're just not going to get a good idea of how your activities run. So your post-campaign studies test for success against your core strategic KPI. And some examples of this could be a brand survey or an incrementality test. And then finally, as we make our way up the ladder, we want to be looking at media effectiveness. So with every step, your measurement becomes like the view is over a longer period of time. So with your media effectiveness, you want to look at your media contribution across medium or long-term impact across key metrics. So some media effectiveness studies could be employing or econometrics, maybe having a geo study or brand tracking over time to see how awareness or consideration changes within your key user base. And then this slide just ties everything together. So I won't go over it again, but I just wanted to illustrate how the ladder comes together so you can measure your campaigns in lots of different ways. And then finally, to tie up this section, this slide we'll come back to later, but in order to maximize your insights, you should be consolidating your budgets. And this is because you'll have more access to measurement for that particular channel. So yeah, consolidate your budget so you can plan for your measurement. This will allow you to access as many kind of ranks of that ladder that we've just gone through. If you are spreading your budget too thinly, then you just won't be able to get read across your kind of MMM reads or even have budget to do brand lift surveys. So we'll come back to this later. And then to wrap this section up, I just wanted to recap of what we often see when we work with brands and what you should do instead in the context of measurement. So we often see people confusing objectives with optimization metrics. So you shouldn't just use a platform metric alone, such as CPV or CPM, to judge the success of a campaign. You need to look at the measurement ladder and define both measurable and objective campaign goals before you've even started. We also see that people use attribution to prove impact, but last click attribution rarely reflects incremental effects. So it's important for us to look at the measurement ladder and make sure that before we go live with a campaign, we've mapped out how exactly we're going to measure this campaign. And then finally, we often see tests about proper investment. So people want to test lots of different formats and channels because they're excited, especially when there's a new format that's just been released. But if you don't consolidate your budgets, then you're going to be trying things without measuring them properly and then perhaps turning them off, and you won't know if the campaign has really run very well or not. So you need to plan your campaign so you do have impact. And then the next section we'll go into is empowering creative, which Anna will be going through.
Cool. Thanks, Alice. So this section, I think hopefully it goes without saying that the creative is important when it comes to programmatic. The vast majority of programmatic formats are highly visual, audio being the exception. But again, it's clearly a format where the creative and the message you're getting out there is important. Fundamentally, if you can have the best media plan in the world, you can be reaching exactly your right audience at exactly the right time, and if the message you're serving them isn't what they want to hear, then it was a waste of money. So there's a lot of versions of this type of data, and this is one I quite like. It's data that shows that actually over time, as things have evolved, creative has always consistently been up there. There's been points where other factors it's varied a bit more, but creative has consistently accounted for about half of the marketing effectiveness across all media. And then what this graph on the right shows is the impact when looking specifically at digital campaigns where there is a strong creative, and the significance of the impact of the creative to the performance versus all the other factors. And I think it's very easy, especially in a channel like programmatic, where where the media buying is complex and you do have to have those buying experts, it's very easy to get into the weeds of, well, is it what site am I on, what audience am I buying, and lose sight of the fact that actually the creative is the really important point. I've sat running campaigns before, and creative hasn't arrived until the day before the campaign was meant to go live. It's so often a second thought. So why is this the case? Why are we at a point where creative isn't really pulling its weight a lot of the time in programmatic? There's a lot of factors to this, a lot of which are kind of operational challenges. So looking at things like speed, scale, and cost. It's the investment that goes into creating the formats, and as we'll talk about in a minute, programmatic does need a wide variety of creative, and that's before you start looking at testing and segmenting and personalizing. So the ability for teams to deliver it at the frequency that the media teams are looking for, to be able to keep those campaigns fresh, to deliver the scale and variety that's required, and to justify the investment. Creative can often look more like a cost center than a profit center in the way a lot of businesses run. And then also there's some challenges. I think if you're consistently putting out low quality creative, it's very difficult to then see the impact of it until you put in that time and effort to do new stuff. So there's kind of these operational challenges on the one side and these performance challenges on the other. And solving these requires two things. Firstly, it requires better creative, but secondly, it requires being smart about how you execute on it. And this is a point where a lot of the time I would sit here and go into a pitch for dynamic creative. It could get very technical. We could talk about AI, we can talk about automation, we can talk about data integration. But I think kind of sometimes that's leading into the problem, right? With a lot of programmatic channels, it looks daunting, and actually sometimes the solutions look even more daunting than that. So what I want to do today is just actually not go too far down that route, and instead just talk about, well, let's take it back. If at the moment you're running display banners, let's say, that just don't really fit in with your brand, yes, you could personalize them and it would have an impact. Yes, you could scale it. Yes, you could automate it. Yes, you could use AI. Those would all have wonderful benefits. But actually, let's stop, and before we do that, let's just go back to the basics and say, what should those creatives be and how should we be planning these? So I think there's 4 points here that I want to make, and then a couple that I'll go into in a bit more detail. I apologise that this is awfully wordy for a creative section as well. The first is making sure that you're being digital first, and that's in design. But I think it's also very specifically worth pointing out it's actually in the concept itself. I think a lot of the time what we see is the campaign concepts, creative concepts are created at a brand level. Often the TV ad is the hero. Some brands then take that TV ad and use it everywhere. You'll see a lot of that on things like YouTube, more egregiously even occasionally on social media as well. But it's not just about going, okay, well, I know I need to adapt this. I need to put the logo up front because that's what YouTube says is best practice. It's about actually thinking about, does this concept work in these environments? So taking into account those digital requirements right at that initial ideation stage, rather than coming up with a great concept and then trying to make it work for digital. Planning creative and media synergistically. This is really important. I've often tried to draw a diagram that illustrates this and try to lay out a workflow. And I find you end up in an awful lot of loops going back and forth, because fundamentally, both of them have to take into account what the other side is doing. I talk a lot about creative-led planning, but realistically, it's difficult to purely lead with creative without an idea of what the media is doing as well. So it's making sure that those teams are really working together really well at the planning stage. Adapting for the environment. So even once you've got to a point where it works for digital, making that creative really play for the right place. So an example with digital video, for example, is the differences between a YouTube video and a paid social video and a CTV video, right? Those are all, they can have broadly the same concept, but they all need very different executions. And that's before you start getting into platforms like display. And then finally, it's making sure that testing and measurement is aligned with overall campaign activation. Again, what we frequently see is the media campaign is optimizing, say, to a ROAS, and the creative is optimizing to CTR. We need to be all on the same page in terms of how we approach that. So what I wanted to talk about, given that this is programmatic, not creative webinar, is sort of focus in on those kind of quite media specific things, thinking, yeah, how do we really make creative work for programmatic channels? And the first thing of that is, what do we mean by platform first, and what are the principles behind that? And I would always make sure that fundamentally you're getting these right, as I say, before we start talking about personalization and automation and so on. First point is understand how users engage in the environment. Is this somewhere, well, for a start, is this an ad that can be clicked on? CTV is, again, different to YouTube in that regard, for example. But it's also more than that. It's, is this a highlight of the content? Is this an in-stream ad, or is this a display ad that's sat off to the side that's kind of a bit more distracting? They're less likely to click on that because it's taking them away from what they're currently doing, or are they in an environment where actually they're kind of looking for that distraction? How are users used to interacting with these sorts of formats, and what are we trying to get them to do? Secondly is applying conventions and best practices. The likes of YouTube and Facebook and Gum, they all have their creative best practices. And they're there for a reason. They can see at scale what works, and it's not something we should ignore just to try to be different. But at the same time, what is important is knowing how and when to challenge those, when what little things you can do that really bring your brand through. And then attention, I think, is something that's important. It's not actually something we're talking about that much in this webinar today. But it's something that is, I think, slightly, if not controversial, at least debated about how best attention measurement should be used within programmatic campaigns. And I think this is one of the really good use cases of it, actually, is not necessarily looking to increase and constantly grow attention time. I think some formats work well as short attention, but understanding what that average attention time looks like. How long do people typically watch a YouTube ad? How long do people spend looking at a display ad? If they're only going to spend 1 second looking at your ad, don't write a paragraph that explains every single product benefit. So really thinking about that attentive time, and how do you get your message across, or how do you adjust that message to make sure that something can be got across in that time. Fourthly, it's build for as many formats as you can. You want to maximize your reach. Also, from a media perspective, you want to have those chances to buy efficiently, and you get more of those by covering a lot of formats. But having said that, there's a caveat to this, which is also don't do it for the sake of it. I think we see this a lot with sort of mobile formats, the 320 by 50 banners at the bottom of a mobile, of people trying to cram in the same amount of content into one of those as they have into a kind of a big skyscraper. Clearly that's not going to work. You either adapt your message to fit, or you don't buy it. It's a waste of money to buy a creative format that isn't going to communicate anything to the user. And then finally, there's a point around brand consistency. Now, obviously, you need to have that brand consistency. We all know, I think, now the importance of getting your distinctive brand assets into everything you do, for example. But also, it's making sure you're sufficiently native to where you're showing up. How your brand shows up in social, in TV, in display. It should be absolutely recognisable. There should be that clear element of continuity, but thinking about how does this work within this environment with this audience, and being smart about how you play with those codes. And then the second thing I wanted to kind of dive into a bit is what I was talking about in terms of synergies between media and creative. And there's kind of 4 areas, again, I think to focus on here. And the first is planning. And even before you get to the plan, actually, it's about the briefing process. I think very often this doesn't happen. Either the creative team and media team get briefed separately, or one of them starts the work and then the other gets briefed later. And really, it is important that they're all working to the same brief, both in terms of having the same information, taking the same things into consideration, and most specifically making sure that everyone's agreed on what those objectives are, and how you're going to tackle achieving those. Who is your audience, for example. And then when it comes to the planning, is making sure you're truly integrated. As I say, I lean slightly more to a creative first approach. in the sense of, fundamentally what you're trying to do with marketing is you're trying to communicate. So you have to have that comm strategy up front. But it's very much not a case of creators should do the work and then media should do their work. Yes, the media has to be selected to find formats, to find environments where that message will be amplified, where it will get the most impact. But also, the media is also sort of an example for making sure we're buying efficiently. And that requires certain formats and certain things from the creative as well. So it very much needs to be a cyclical process with a few rounds of connection between the two teams there. Execution, again, start with what you'd hope is an obvious point, just around timelines, managing expectations on both sides. When does the media team actually need the creative buy in order to get it through all the approval processes? Creative teams tend to think it's the day before. In practice, that is not true. So making sure that that's all clear, and also that there's enough time for feedback, so that if things don't look like they're going to work, there's the time to make those adjustments. And then efficiency, and this is where we do start going down that sort of dynamic creative automation route a bit, is thinking about not just how can the creative team execute effectively and efficiently, but also how does the whole team as a whole execute efficiently. If you've got a trafficking team, their work is massively cut down if you're providing them with a dynamic creative versus having to upload 100 different versions of an ad and target 100 different audiences with it, for example. So again, this is somewhere where having some cross expertise in the two teams to understand how everyone works can really help you get to a really smooth operation. Measurement, Alice has talked a lot about this, but I think it's just important, and she did touch on this a couple of times as well, making sure creative is incorporated into that. Again, making sure you're optimizing towards the same metrics and KPIs, but also thinking about, creative does come with some specific metrics. When you've designed that creative, you're thinking about how is someone going to interact with this? Are we expecting them to click on it? Maybe it's actually an interactive ad in itself. Maybe we are expecting them, the critical point is that they view the first 10 seconds of the ad. And thinking about, well, given that is kind of a core success metric, how do we factor that into our media optimization as well? And then finally, around testing. Testing is important across the board, and designing rigorous, well-structured tests is important. But again, this is something where actually it is important for the two teams to work together, to understand how is the campaign being structured, what are my line items, my IOs, how does that impact how I should be testing my creative. The strategy might say, well, this is our demographic and our audience persona. How has the media team turned that into active, addressable audiences, and therefore how does the creative need to be structured across those? And then again, I'll finish on what is hopefully another obvious point, but making sure the creative team have access to all the learnings from the campaign, that they're not just there in the planning and then kept out of the loop of how the campaign went, making sure that's all being fed back and used for future campaigns. So in terms of takeaways that I'd want to come out of the creative section, I think creative isn't an afterthought. It should never be an afterthought. It should be, absolutely the first thing you think about is what is the message we're trying to get out and how are we doing that most effectively. And then, the one of the driving forces of how you plan the media should be what media is going to get this message across. Where is this going to resonate and with whom? So it's really having that single workflow. Again, we see a lot of recycled creative. We see TV being used for YouTube. We see, tube ads being cut up for display. It really is important to treat them as creative projects in their own right, and taking that platform first approach. And finally, making sure you're not optimizing it in isolation. The creative and the media do work hand in hand. They need to be working towards the same goals. And they need to be optimized in tandem as well. And that brings us on to our last section on media, so I'll hand back to Alice.
Thanks, Anna. Fab. So our last section, as Anna said, is well-managed media. So as we've talked about already, our audience that we want to target is everywhere. They might be on display channels, YouTube, connected TV, audio, in-game. There are lots of different areas that we can access these audiences, but we need to consider when and where will these people respond best to our message. So a lot of people like to chase those cheap CPMs because they think that they can reach lots of people and their budget will go really far. But even though these are low CPMs are attractive to marketers, the efficiency gains are offset by a decrease in effectiveness. And there are a couple of reasons why. So the first is if we are chasing that low CPM inventory, then we might be accessing inventory which is kind of full of bots or made for advertising sites, basically sites that we don't want to appear on. So that can cause low brand perception. Also, if we're chasing low cost inventory, then we might be appearing on inventory which has low viewability. So you might be appearing on inventory below the fold on lots of websites or in just hard to find places. So it won't be worth appearing on those in the first place. And then finally, or linked to this, is low attention placements as well. We want to appear in locations which have high visibility and attention. So by optimizing towards these low CPMs, you're actually optimizing away from those effective metrics. So on the flip side, if you are paying a little bit more, then you're likely to be appearing in front of people who are going to be more receptive to your message and better placement quality. So it is worth paying those extra pennies to access this inventory. So it pays dividends by running your activity this way, as you'll be able to access high impact placements. So an example might be a CTV placement, which is if you make sure you're optimized towards TV, you'll get the whole TV screen and just generate a lot more attention and better viewability. And there'll also be more eyeballs on this activity as well. So CTV activity, for example, isn't a one-to-one. It's not just one person watching that CTV placement. There are lots of people in a house who might be watching CTV at the same time. So you'll have a better impact by paying more money. Linked to that, you'll get a great brand halo effect. So by spending more on the inventory you're appearing on, you're more likely to access better placements. So you might be able to access inventory slots right at the top of a website, which again will have better visibility and better attention as well. And by appearing on these more premium and better inventory, you'll create a brand halo effect whereby your brand is being seen in these great placements. So it indicates that you're a more premium and better quality brand. And then finally, publisher partnerships. So curation is the buzzword at the moment. But it is really important that you work with these publishers to maximize on contextual data and audience data as well, so that the inventory you're bidding on is as closely aligned with the audience you want to access as possible. Paying more, you'll get access to all of these different metrics. And when there are so many providers that you can work with within programmatic, and that is another way why the ecosystem is just so complicated and complex. But it's important that we evaluate these media partners or any kind of providers that we're working with. And we use our Cameo framework to help us decide whether we should work with a partner. So although this looks quite overwhelming on the slide, I'll break it down and just talk about a couple of different points. So with the Cameo framework, when we're working with a media partner, we first want to look at what creative formats are available. Does a partner provide unique formats that we can't get access to elsewhere? Do they provide creative build support for free? Or what are the personalization capabilities that we can access by using this media partner? We also look at audience reach. Again, can we access a unique audience within that format? If we can, and it's relevant to the brand we're working with or the brand we are, then we do want to appear on that format or media partner. Media efficiency is also something that's important to consider. So this is all around viewability, how we can measure the campaigns, can we access those brand lift surveys or other similar surveys. Environment and quality, we want to make sure that we are appearing on brand safe inventory and inventory that's suitable for the brand as well. So is there any integration of verification partners, or can we curate the inventory with that partner? And then finally, operational efficiency. We need to see if we can actually work with that media partner. How quick are the turnaround times? Is there a minimum budget? And what are the other requirements we need to consider before going live here? So there's lots of things you can think about, but yeah, we've just put a few on those slides. But we have an example on this slide of how this might look. So it's useful to create a whole bank of these reviews so that you've met with all your media partners and you know exactly what they can offer and how it could benefit your brand. So this is an example, and although it doesn't have Cameo down the side, it does use the Cameo framework and considers lots of these different points. So I've just written an example for a generic display partner as an example for you to take away. But if you have lots of these for each of the media partners you work with, then you might find you still have so much information and it's hard to decide who you want to work with. So what you can also do is you can rank your media partners as well. So see which media partners work best for you and then provide them internally on your documentation with a score, so you know how well this could work for your brand. It's worth mentioning as well, partners that you might work with are releasing products and new features all the time, so you do need to keep on top of meeting with these partners to make sure you still understand how they can work with your brand most effectively. And I mentioned that we would return to the slide later on. So again, I wanted to talk about maximizing insights through budget consolidation. So we already talked about the first point earlier on, where we want to make sure we have sufficient budget for brand or conversion lift studies. But in the context of well-managed media, we want to make sure we are planning for reach. So we haven't talked about frequency too much today, but by consolidating your budget, you'll have more budget within a certain channel to target people multiple times. It's not generally worth it just accessing someone once, but you might need to show your ad to people several times. And there are ways that you can measure reach across the different formats that you might have live, but it is an important consideration. And it's worth working with those media partners to recommend what the frequency could be for your campaigns. You can also do testing to find out the optimal frequency as well. And then again, budget consolidation is important because you want to plan for smooth operations. So there are lots of platforms that require a spend threshold. And also it can take a number of weeks for certain campaigns to be fully optimized. When you first go live with a campaign, your algorithms just aren't mature, so you need to make sure that you're running your campaign over a number of weeks, so you generate the best performance. And some campaigns take longer than others, so I wouldn't recommend running a really short campaign or a campaign with a tiny budget, because it's just not going to reach the algorithm's full potential. And then to just go over this section, you need to reach your audience not just where they are, but when they're ready to hear your message. And so we've talked through several ways that you can make sure you're in the right place for your audience. So we often find that people are hunting for the cheapest media, and this it's not worth it for your budget, because even though you might be delivering more impressions, they might not be very effective. So you need to make sure that you're appearing on premium inventory by looking at the CPMs and investigating the media evaluation framework that we've just gone through. Context is also forgotten. So you need to think about where you are showing your ads, and that relates to what Anna has just spoken about in the creative section as well. And then don't diversify your media at the expense of performance. Although it can be exciting, testing lots of different partners or formats, you just won't be able to measure properly. And you also might not even be able to appear on the platform or the format if there are certain thresholds you need to meet. So you need to invest for maximum impact and structured learnings that you can take forward to future campaigns.